By the end of this video, you will know all of the tight ends that could theoretically be the tight end one for us in 2024 fantasy football. We're going to take a look at the last 5 years tight end ones, targets, receptions, yards, and touchdowns, then figure out the averages between them, as well as the low marks to hit in order to be the tight end one, and take a look at the tight ends that could potentially meet the minimum thresholds and the average thresholds. Please remember to like and subscribe. I would love to be able to continue doing these videos. Let's get into it. The past couple of seasons, we've seen that it's Travis Kelce, Andrews, Kelce, and Sam Laporta since 2019 up until this past season. Now, the tight end one finishes are going to be a little bit inflated because Travis Kelce's been so much better than all the other tight ends consistently since 2016. So we see that over the past 5 seasons, the tight end one overall has had 141 targets, 101 receptions, 1,247 receiving yards, and 9 receiving touchdowns on average. We're going to take a look at a couple of tight ends that could theoretically hit these benchmarks. So the first tight end we're going to mention here is Sam Laporta of the Detroit Lions. He's coming off a tight end one finish in which he had 14.1 fantasy points per game. He was a rookie, so there's nothing to compare that to in his career. However, when we think about his situation, he is a member of the Detroit Lions, one of the best offenses in the NFL. It's going to be incredibly efficient this season under Ben Johnson, their creative offensive coordinator. He has Jared Goff, a non-scrambling quarterback, which is great for pass-catching production. He's the second target under Amon-Ra St. Brown in the passing game. Look, they're going to score a lot of touchdowns this season, and Sam Laporta had 10 this past season. He is definitely a candidate to repeat there, potentially exceed that if he's lucky. He is absolutely a candidate to be the tight end one for us once again in fantasy football. So Sam Laporta is coming off his tight end one finish as a rookie, which is thoroughly impressive. His 120 targets were good for 5th. His target share of 21.1 was good for 6th. That's his amount of the team's total passes, his targets specifically. And his target rate of 24% was good for 5th. That's his targets per route run, which is his total targets divided by the amount of routes in which he ran this past season. His 86 receptions were good for 4th. His 889 receiving yards were good for 5th. His 10 touchdowns were first in the NFL among the tight end position, and his 14.1 fantasy points per game were good for 3rd. When we look at his metrics, he's an above average athlete for a tight end. His 4.59 40-yard dash really sticks out. I mean, he's an Iowa tight end. What else can we expect from them but fantasy dominance at this point? When we look at his stats, specifically his targets, receptions, yards, and touchdowns versus the low marks for the tight end one the past 5 seasons and the averages, his 120 targets were the fewest among the tight end one finishers. His 86 receptions were also the fewest. His 889 yards were also the fewest. However, his 10 touchdowns were above the minimum mark of 5 set by Travis Kelce in 2019. And his 14.1 fantasy points per game were the low mark among tight end one finishers. When we look at his stats compared to the averages, his targets, receptions, and yards are all lower than the averages. However, his 10 touchdowns were above the average of 9, and his 14.1 fantasy points per game were below the average of 17.4. Although, to be fair to him, that is a little bit boosted by the fact that Travis Kelce exists. But we can expect some improvement from Sam Laporta. He did this as a rookie, and he's still in an elite offense that's going to be incredibly efficient. So he is absolutely a threat to repeat as a tight end one in 2024 fantasy football. So next we have Travis Kelce of the Kansas City Chiefs. He's coming off a tight end 3 finish with 14.6 fantasy points per game. That is the lowest mark he's had since 2016, and he's been the tight end one just about every single season since then. We're used to consistent fantasy dominance from Travis Kelce. Now, with him being a little under 35 years old, he's definitely lost a step. However, he was so much better than the other tight ends that he's still an elite option for us. When we think about their offense, it is going to be a little bit more crowded this season. They drafted Xavier Worthy, the speed demon. Then they signed Hollywood Brown, so they're going to have 2 vertical threats in the passing game. And the only underneath option that he really has to contend with is Rashee Rice. He is definitely better than Rashee Rice. So I expect Travis Kelce to still be the number 1 option in this offense. I just don't think that the volume is going to be quite as high as it has been throughout his career. But regardless of that, he's still connected to Patrick Mahomes. It's going to be a really good offense this season. And so he is definitely still an elite option for us and definitely a candidate to be the tight end 1 for us in 2024 fantasy football. So Kelsey's coming off a tight end 3 finish, which is strange. We've been used to him being the tight end 1 and by a good margin for the majority of his career. When we look at his targets, his 121 were good for 4th, his 22.7% target share, which remember is his amount of the total targets in the offense, was good for 3rd. His 24.7 target rate was good for 4th. Remember, that's his targets per route run rate, which is his amount of targets divided by the amount of routes in which he ran. His 93 receptions were good for 3rd. His 984 receiving yards were good for 2nd. His 5 total touchdowns were good for 7th, and his 14.6 fantasy points per game were good for 1st. So Travis Kelce didn't play all 17 games this past season, so I figured out what his stats would have been based on his per game averages and then multiplied that out by 17. So when we look at the stats that he would have had if he had played 17 games versus the minimum thresholds for the tight end 1, his 137 targets would have beaten out the minimum of 120, his 105 receptions would have beaten the minimum of 86, his 1,115 yards would have beaten the minimum of 899, and his 6 touchdowns would have beaten the minimum of 5. So he would have beaten all of the minimum thresholds from the past 5 seasons. However, when we look at the average thresholds, his 137 targets would have been a little bit under the 141 average. His 105 receptions would have been over the average of 101. His 1,115 receiving yards would have been under the 1,247 average, and his 6 touchdowns would have been under the 9 average. Really, it's his performance this past season versus his performance mostly over the past 5 seasons, with the exception of 2. This guy is still going to be a dominant tight end 1 for us in fantasy football, and a threat to be the tight end 1 overall. It's just that the disparity between him and the other tight ends is negligible now. The next tight end that we're going to discuss is Evan Ingram of the Jacksonville Jaguars. He's coming off a tight end 2 season in which he had 13.6 fantasy points per game. Throughout his career, he's been inconsistent due to injury. He started off on a high note, though, with 11.6 fantasy points per game, then had 11.3, then hit a career-high mark of 13.7 in his 3rd season. Then, throughout 2 injury-riddled years, he only had 8.8 and 6.8. Then once he left the Giants, he really stepped it up once again. In 2022, he had 10.4 fantasy points per game, and this past season he had 13.6, which was 4th. This guy is a target monster. He's Trevor Lawrence's preferred option. He's going to eat once again. I do think that his ceiling is a little bit capped, though, because they drafted Brian Thomas Jr. They also signed Gabe Davis, so there's going to be more of a vertical component to this offense. So that is going to draw some targets. He's still going to be the most targeted player on this offense, though, and is absolutely a threat to be the tight end 1 for us in fantasy football. So Evan Ingram finished as a tight end 2 once again this past season. His 143 targets were good for 1st by a decent margin. His 23.8 target share was good for 2nd. His 23.7 target rate was good for 7th. His 114 receptions were good for 1st. His 963 receiving yards were good for 3rd. His 4 touchdowns were good for 12th. And his 13.5 fantasy points per game were good for 4th. When we look at the metrics, he is an elite tight end as an athlete. His 4.42 40-yard dash really stands out. That's crazy. When we compare his targets, receptions, yards, and touchdowns versus the minimum thresholds, his 143 targets were above the minimum threshold of 120. His 114 receptions were above the minimum threshold of 86. His 963 yards were above the minimum threshold of 899. However, his 4 touchdowns were below the minimum threshold of 5. So he beat out the minimum in 3 of these 4 stats this past season. When we look at his stats compared to the average tight end 1 over the past 5 seasons, his 143 targets was above the average of 141. His 114 receptions were also above the average of 101. His 963 yards, however, were much less than the average of 1,247. So overall, he was really a volume-driven monster. And now, while I do expect his volume to be slightly reduced now that they have Brian Thomas and Gabe Davis there, he's still an elite option for us at tight end and is absolutely an option and a threat to be the tight end 1 for us in 2024 fantasy football. The next tight end we're going to be discussing here is Mark Andrews of the Baltimore Ravens. He's coming off a tight end 14 finish in which he had 13.5 fantasy points per game. He's been dominant ever since his 2nd season. As a rookie, he had 6.7, then he stepped it up to 13.8 fantasy points per game, then 12.2, 17.7, which was his high mark, 12.7, and 13.5 this past season. So he's connected to Lamar Jackson. They have a special connection between the two of them. He is the number one target in the passing game. One thing to consider here is they did bring in Derrick Henry, which I do think is going to improve the efficiency of the offense and isn't really going to hurt Mark Andrews at all. And then in terms of his target competition, Zay Flowers is really the only credible threat to his target share, which he is still going to be the most targeted player in this offense. And the two of them can peacefully coexist. They are by far the best options in the passing game for Baltimore. It's going to be a really great year for the offense overall. And Mark Andrews is absolutely a candidate to be the tight end 1 overall in 2024 fantasy football. So Mark Andrews is coming off a tight end 14 finish, but once again, he didn't play as many games this past season. When we extrapolate his stats out based on his per game averages to 17, he would have finished with 104 targets, with 77 receptions for 925 yards and 10 touchdowns. When we compare that against the minimum thresholds to be the tight end 1, his 104 targets would have been lower than the 120 minimum threshold. His 77 receptions would have been lower than the 86. His 925 yards, however, would have been over the minimum of 899, and his 10 touchdowns would have been above the minimum of 5. His 13.5 fantasy points per game, however, would have been under the 14.1 necessary. When we look at his stats as if he had played 17 games versus the average, his 104 targets would have been under the 141 average. His 77 receptions would have been under the 101 average. His 925 receiving yards would have been under the 1247 average. However, his 10 touchdowns would have been above the 9 average. So he doesn't meet the average thresholds for a majority of the things except for touchdowns. He's still the preferred option for Lamar Jackson, though, and is the number one option in his offense, which is very rare for a tight end. And so for that reason, he could definitely have a bounce back year and is absolutely a threat to be the tight end 1 for us in 2024 fantasy football. So now we have Dalton Kincaid of the Buffalo Bills. He's coming off a tight end 11 finish in which he had 9.4 fantasy points per game. He was a rookie, so that's actually a very, very good season for a rookie tight end. Not everybody is going to have a Sam Laporta or Kyle Pitts type rookie year, so tight end 11 is still great, especially considering he had Stephon Diggs there. When we think about the offense now, he's going to be the leading target earner for them. They traded away Stephon Diggs to the Texans. They drafted Keon Coleman. I don't think they're going to use Keon Coleman correctly, and so I think that Dalton Kincaid is going to be the main beneficiary of that. The other options in the passing game are Khalil Shakir, so really nothing to worry about there, and Curtis Samuel, same thing. When we think about their defense, they had an excess of talent, including Tre'Davious White and both starting safeties. Their defense is going to be terrible. They're going to have to pass the ball quite often. And so Dalton Kincaid is going to be the centerpiece of the offense and is absolutely a threat to be the tight end 1 for us in 2024 fantasy football. So Dalton Kincaid, once again, is coming off a tight end 11 finish. His 91 targets were good for 8th. His 17.7% target share was good for 14th. His 20% target rate was good for 16th. His 73 receptions were good for 7th. His 673 receiving yards were good for 10th. His 2 touchdowns were only 27th. And his 9.4 fantasy points per game were good for 14th. Once again, he's now going to be the number 1 target in this offense, with the Bills' defense being much worse. He's going to have a much better season in 2024 than he did in 2023, and he was still the tight end 11 as a rookie, which is great for a rookie tight end. When we look at his 40-yard dash and speed score, they're both above 50th percentile, so he is a good athlete. And when we look at his stats as if he had played 17 games, he only played in 16 this past season. He would have had 97 targets for 78 receptions, 715 yards, and 2 touchdowns. When we compare that against the minimum thresholds to be the tight end 1, his 97 targets would have been below the 120 minimum, his 78 receptions would have been below the 86 minimum, his 715 yards would have been below the 899, and his 2 touchdowns would have been below the 5 minimum, with his 9.5 fantasy points per game being under the 14.1 necessary. So he's obviously not going to meet the average thresholds either. The argument, though, is now he's the number 1 target. The defense is terrible. He's connected to Josh Allen, who, by the way, did give him some of the most accurate targets for a tight end. So with him being an above-average tight end, now being the centerpiece of this Bills offense, He is absolutely a threat to be the tight end one for us in 2024 fantasy football. The next tight end we're going to mention here is Trey McBride of the Arizona Cardinals. He's coming off a tight end 7 finish in which he had 10.7 fantasy points per game. That's actually really impressive because he wasn't even a starting tight end the first half of the season. One fun fact, from the point in which he became a starter until the end of the season, he was the tight end one. Well, when we think about a situation, he was easily the only target in the passing game at the point in which he became a starter. Hollywood Brown was hurt, and so Kyler Murray had to throw to somebody. But that doesn't mean Trey McBride isn't good. He's really good. He was the tight end one over the course of the second half of the season. However, they did draft Marvin Harrison Jr. and let Hollywood Brown walk. Trey McBride is going to be relegated to the second option in this offense. However, that is still fantastic. Their defense, by the way, gave up the second most total points in the NFL this past season. And guess what? Their defense is still terrible. They're going to have to throw the ball quite often. And Trey McBride is absolutely a threat to be the tight end one for us in fantasy football. Because once again, he was the tight end one over the course of the second half of this past season. So Trey McBride is coming off a tight end 7 finish. His 106 targets were good for 6th. His 19.6 target share was good for 9th. His 26.1 target rate was good for 1st. His 81 receptions were good for 5th. His 825 receiving yards were good for 7th. His 3 touchdowns were only good for 18th, but his 10.7 fantasy points per game were good for 8th. Remember to contextualize this by knowing that he was only a starter for half of the season, so a lot of these are incredibly impressive considering that. When we look at his targets, receptions, yards, and touchdowns versus the minimum thresholds, he doesn't meet any of them, to be honest with you, but he also is only a starter for half of the season. And obviously, if they don't beat the minimum thresholds, they're not going to meet the average thresholds either. I do expect him to be a serious threat to be the tight end one, though, this season, because even though he's going to likely be the second target behind MHJ, the defense is still atrocious, and this guy was the tight end one for us in the second half of this past season. The next tight end we're going to talk about is Kyle Pitts of the Atlanta Falcons. He's coming off a tight end 12 finish in which he had 8.1 fantasy points per game. Okay, so he was supposed to be the unicorn, and as a rookie, he definitely was. He averaged over 10 fantasy points per game as a rookie, which was 11th most in the NFL, en route to a tight end 6 finish. That was in an Arthur Smith scheme with the ghost of Matt Ryan throwing him the ball. So then the next season, Matt Ryan left. He had to deal with Marcus Mariota as his quarterback in an Arthur Smith scheme. Things weren't going well for him because the targets were atrocious. Look those up on YouTube. The targets were awful. There are compilations of him overthrowing Pitts. Yuck. Then he suffered an MCL tear. Okay, so that season was lost. Then this past season, everyone was expecting him to be the tight end one practically. And so because he had to still deal with Arthur Smith, he was coming off an MCL tear, which hampered his side-to-side agility and made it really hard for him to run routes. While dealing with Desmond Ridder or Taylor Heineke throws, people were expecting him to be the tight end one practically. Of course, he was going to have a bad season. In no way, shape, or form was he set up for success. And people make all these excuses for other players, but for him, he sucks and he's a bust. It is beyond me. Okay, so this season, he's going to be another year removed from that injury. He received 2 quarterback upgrades, and either Michael Penix, but presumably Kirk Cousins, but also Arthur Smith, get out of here. Now we have the Ram scheme thanks to Zach Robinson. This is going to be an incredible offense. He is going to be the second option behind Drake London, but this is going to be an explosive offense. He is absolutely a candidate to be the tight end one for us in 2024 fantasy football. So once again, Pitts is coming off a tight end 12 finish. His 89 targets were good for 11th. His 17.8% target share was good for 13th. His 19.3 target rate was good for 20th. His 53 receptions were good for 16th. His 667 receiving yards were good for 11th. His 3 touchdowns were only 18th. And his 8.1 fantasy points per game were 16th. And once again, it's important to remember that he was coming off an MCL tear with ridiculously bad quarterback play. No consistency either in terms of his quarterback and Arthur Smith's scheme. When we look at his metrics, he is a unicorn. He has 99th percentile 40-yard dash speed and speed score, and is above 50th percentile in every single one of these metrics. He is an amazing athlete. When we look at his stats compared to the minimum thresholds, to be honest with you, none of them meet any of the minimum thresholds, and so if they don't meet the minimum, they're not going to meet the average either. The argument here is he's another year removed from the knee injury in a much better scheme, the Ram scheme, with 2 quarterback upgrades, including Kirk Cousins, who has made some tight ends fantasy stars, although they were talented in their own right, like TJ Hawkinson. So I expect an incredible season from Kyle Pitts, and he is absolutely a threat to be the tight end one for us in 2024 fantasy football. The final tight end that we'll be discussing today is George Kittle of the San Francisco 49ers. He's coming off a tight end 5 finish in which he had 12.7 fantasy points per game. Ever since his second season, he's been a dominant fantasy force for us. So as a rookie, he had 7.1 fantasy points per game, then he stepped it up to 16, then 15.9, 15.6, 14.1, 13.4, and finally 12.7 this past season. So the past 5 seasons actually, he's been declining in fantasy points per game. I think that's partially due to a little bit of decline, but also due to the amount of assets they have in the passing game. I mean, he has to contend with Christian McCaffrey, Deebo Samuel, Brandon Ayuk. Now he even has Ricky Pearsall. So I do think that makes it hard for him on a week-to-week basis to receive quite as much of a target share as he's used to. The thing with him is he has arguably the most upside in any given week of any tight end, but he also has one of the lowest floors among the elite tight ends. So he's very inconsistent on a week-to-week basis. But regardless, he is so good and in such an efficient offense that any given year, he absolutely could be the tight end one for us. And so he is absolutely a potential threat to be the tight end one for us in 2024 fantasy football. So once again, George Kittle's coming off a tight end 5 finish. His 90 targets were good for 10th. His 21% target share was good for 7th. His 20.3 target rate was good for 14th. His 65 receptions were good for 10th. His 1,020 receiving yards were good for 1st. His 6 touchdowns were good for 2nd. And his 12.7 fantasy points per game were good for 6th. When we look at his workout metrics, this guy is one of the best athletes we have ever seen at the tight end position. So with him being in a good situation and being an amazing athlete, it's no surprise that he's been a stud basically his entire career at tight end. So George Kittle didn't play in all 17 games, but I figured out his stats as if he would have played 17 games. Comparing those to the minimum thresholds, his 96 targets would have been below the 120 minimum. His 69 receptions would have been below the 86 minimum. His 1,084 receiving yards, however, would have been above the 889 minimum. And his 6 touchdowns also would have been above the 5 minimum, while his 12.6 fantasy points per game definitely would have been below the 14.1 minimum. When we look at his stats against the average, none of them meet the average marks. So generally, he wouldn't have beaten out Travis Kelce for the tight end one with his stats this past season. But he's in an amazing offense. He has the most upside, in my opinion, of any tight end from week to week. At least he has the past couple of seasons. He's one of the best athletes we've ever seen, and he is absolutely a threat to be the tight end one in 2024 fantasy football. So, in my opinion, Sam Laporta is going to repeat as a tight end one. However, I do think it's going to be relatively close between basically every tight end that I've mentioned today. He's in what you could argue is going to be the best offense. It's going to be incredibly efficient. Ben Johnson is an amazing play caller. He has a quarterback who doesn't have the best arm strength and doesn't run the ball. That leads to targeting Sam Laporta underneath, but Sam Laporta is still a threat down the seams. He's a great route runner. He's dependable in the red zone. He has more touchdown upside than 10. In my opinion, he is going to repeat as a tight end one. I think he'll get a couple more targets, receptions, yards. Touchdowns could vary a little bit, but he is absolutely a threat for 12 or more touchdowns if he has a very lucky season. And so with that being said, I do think that he is going to be the tight end one for us in 2024 fantasy football. So those are all of the tight ends that I personally believe could theoretically be the tight end one for us in 2024 fantasy football. What do you think? Do you agree with my list? Disagree? Is there somebody that I left out that you think potentially be the tight end 1 this season? Please let me know in the comment section below. Feel free to check out my running backs that could be number 1 overall and my quarterbacks that could finish number 1 overall videos above. I go through the exact same analysis as I did in this video. Please remember to like and subscribe. It would mean the absolute world to me. Thank you and have a good day.